and welcome to Crumbs under the table. My daily walk with my dogs and sharing a few thoughts as we go. So we're going slightly off the beaten track this morning. It's something a route I don't take too often because there's not a proper path, but there is a place that people walk alongside. There's a kind of a stream up this way that we're heading towards. It's the border of this field, which grows wheat otherwise, as you can see. And I'm kind of living in great hope that the path is still clear. Just I thought we'd take a slight bit of variety today. Good. So just a short thought really this morning. Just I was thinking of well, some of you'll be aware I do I actually kind of teach through all of the ministry of Jesus quite regularly, and we kind of harmonise the different Gospels, bring all their perspectives in and so on. But the bit I do most regularly is the last week. And it just struck me the other day, because I can remember very often when I've done that, there's you highlight, say at for instance, at the Crucifixion, that none of the disciples are there in the text. The exception to that, of course, is John. John is the only one, and actually there's a period where even he's gone, which we'll come to in a second. I can always remember, for some people that's a surprise, and I can remember some people find it difficult even to. It's odd, but they find it hard to kind of get their head around. I remember one person who was quite versed in the Bible. That's a good way of putting it, isn't it? She'd actually been to Bible college, and she couldn't accept it. And I was saying, well, none of the disciples were there. And she then kind of turned back a statement I often used to use on me. I say this in a nice way. I'm not being kind of be competitive. It's just because I would often kind of highlight that just the fact that the gospel doesn't mention someone being there doesn't mean that they're not there. And so I would kind of make that kind of point that it's often the case when you're harmonising. You see, in one gospel it refers to someone, another it doesn't mention them. It doesn't mean that they're not there. That's common reporting in any kind of narrative document about a real event. So anyway, she turned that principle around. So, well, just the fact that it doesn't say they're there, I can't believe they wouldn't be. They're all, they're just there at a distance. And it's just the women who we have the kind of the records of what they say and do and so on. So I thought, well, okay, that's a fair enough point. But it just struck me the other day. There's actually a little bit in the bit where, in the Last Supper, Jesus teaches more extensively to his disciples, and he. I'm just looking at all of the nettles here. This is going to be fun. I'm going to have lacerated legs. So don't say I don't suffer for my teaching. Where Jesus says, about the Father loves you because he loves me. And then he makes a statement. He says, very soon you're all going to desert me and go to your own houses. Now, remember, this is Jerusalem. And most of Jesus' disciples come from Galilee, but they will have locations to stay. They've probably been staying out in Bethany, so the majority of them, that's been their gathering point. But even within that context, in the Tarapian Valley, there's a lot of artisan houses, and there'll be things that are kind of linked. So, for instance, for Peter with his fishing business, we'll almost certainly have contacts there. John talks about going back to his own house, which is in Jerusalem, and so on. So in this kind of context, but basically the key thing here is everyone's going to desert me. And of course, the only point that actually ever happens is at Jesus' crucifixion. Because remember, we often forget the context when we read these verses. This is the Last Supper. Jesus is going to be arrested. They're all going to flee, except for Peter, except for John. Peter and John are going to head. Whoa, this was not a good route. Not a smart way of doing it this morning. Peter and John are going to follow down to Annas' house. John seems to have access the house, we cover that when we do the teaching in more depth. And he gets Peter into the house as well, and they watch, if you like, what is not Jesus' trial. It's often confusing to people. It's the pre-trial, it's the discovery period, where Jesus is being interrogated by Annas rather than being presented before the Sanhedrin. The Gospels are actually very clear on that. It's a separate phase, and it doesn't happen at night, it happens during the day. So we often erroneously hear that, I'll turn this around. Well, actually I won't, because you're looking at my face. I'm getting stung all over my legs at the moment. I'm kind of therefore having to step through things, so it's probably easier if I just kind of point it forwards. That was just a slight kind of throwaway aside on that kind of issue. But Jesus is going to be arrested, he's going to be tried, but Peter and John are there. But Peter, of course, in his denial, he's outside in the dark of the courtyard, watching in through the door, as Jesus is being interrogated by Annas. And 3 times he's approached, and people saying, "You're Galilean, surely, aren't you one of his disciples?" And it's likely that John has been more honest about his relationship in following him, but he has access. He seems to be known to the household and so on. Just making sure this is recording. Yes, it is. And in that context, he's denied Jesus and he's disappeared off. And we don't meet him again until we meet him actually at John's house after on the resurrection morning. It's the first time we re-meet Peter. He disappears, so he's gone. So now everyone has gone, and they're fulfilling Jesus' prophecy except for John. And John has to leave when Jesus is taken from Annas' house actually to the Sanhedrin, because he doesn't have access there. The testimony we have from Jesus' trial, therefore, is coming from Joseph of Arimathea and from Nicodemus, not from any of the Jesus' disciples as eyewitnesses. And then Jesus is sent, of course, for crucifixion, or for sentencing to Pilate, and of course then taken off for crucifixion. But John is there again. So John is there, but during that period, it's that period where Jesus' mother is there, because it's very likely that the very few people actually in Jerusalem know what's going on. That's part of the whole plan, if you follow the story carefully. The issue is the crowds would stop this thing happening. We say, well, isn't it the crowds that condemned Jesus? Well, they were the crowds immediately around the Praetorium, which are all where the Sadducees, the wealthier, are focused. Nobody knows what's going on. Most of Jesus' followers are camped outside of Jerusalem, who've been cheering him and so on in the days before. So it's a totally different crowd who are in the pockets because of in terms of the influence and the social status and so on of the high priests. And but in that context, Jesus' family are there. Well, they know, because presumably John has gone to find them. It's very likely that John is part of Jesus' extended family. I often kind of highlight it's very likely that he's a nephew. But if he's not a nephew, if you take the testimony of some of the early church writers, you can see he certainly seems to have some very close familial connection with them. I.e., if it's not John, yeah, okay, yeah, I'm not going to go there. That's too long now. It takes too much to kind of get into that. So what was I just saying? So yes, so as a result, of course, yes, John will be aware of where Jesus' family are staying, and so his mother is there, and they're watching from a distance. But his mother is allowed up closer. Mary Magdalene is there. She's actually based out in Bethany, because I treat her as Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, because she's Mary the Magdalene, which means Mary the Tower, or tower-like. Because she's got so much stature in the early church. I believe they're the same person. So she's been based out of Bethany. She's aware of what's going on, because the disciples, many of them who've been focused around Bethany, that's where they've been staying, those are the houses they fled to. And they don't know what's happened to Jesus, and someone has to go into Jerusalem to find out. So she's been the one that's come in, but she's not one of those disciples. Joanna and Susanna are there. Well, I say Susanna. Joanna is definitely there. She's named. There's another woman who's not named, but we meet Joanna and Susanna in Luke's Gospel, and one of the things to understand is in the style of writing that Luke is using, in the naming of people kind of explicitly earlier on in his Gospel with Susanna, it's partly because he's flagging them as an eyewitness, and so it makes most sense that she's the unnamed woman is Susanna. And their connection, they know because Joanna is the wife of Herod's steward, and Jesus has been brought to Herod on the morning of his crucifixion. So she's aware. So they've come out. So everyone who's there knows what's gone on. They understand, but most of the city don't know what's happening at this stage. But in that text, because Jesus' mother is there, Jesus addresses a painful, uncomfortable and distressing thing to watch, and he doesn't want his mother there during the worst moments, which aren't the point where the nails go through the hands. There it's you lose breath, you lose blood, and life becomes excruciating. And so that's the context. So at that point John leaves as well, fulfilling that verse that Jesus said is, you will all leave me. Every one of you will leave me. I will be on my own. But then he says, but don't worry, because the Father loves me and he's with me. Then we think, oh no, but hang on, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, there's a whole complex thing there in the sense of what's Jesus really experiencing. God hasn't abandoned him. He's quoting a psalm. Is he drawing attention to the psalm? My own understanding, my own suspicion at this stage is that actually Jesus is experiencing in himself, if you like, emotionally, he's feeling that place of separation, but he knows logically it's not true. We know that because he finishes by not quoting that psalm, because so it quotes another psalm. He says, into your hands I commit my spirit. And actually in that psalm, if you read it, it talks about how even though I'm in a stressful place, I know you're sort of with me. It's kind of the sum of it. I'm being a little bit caricature-y, but if you go and read it, you'll see it kind of is affirming God's presence in the place of and it even says in there, in my distress, I kind of question where you were. So Jesus has actually gone through that. So Jesus has prophesied something effectively that has happened to him. His disciples have all left. He said it's okay because the Father is with him. And even in that point where, if you like, the separation of sin which Jesus is experiencing on the cross, he's feeling, if you like, the abandonment. And even though God has never abandoned us, you see, our feelings are very much our truth, but they're not the truth. And so, if you like, Jesus is experiencing what it's like for so much of humanity to feel the abandonment of God, even though logically he knows it's not the case, and actually he comes round to the place where he says, into my hands I commit my spirit. But here's the thing, which is my point for this morning, because Jesus has said, in the same way the Father loves me, he loves you. And then he goes on and says, in this life, in this world, you will be persecuted. And that's so relevant. Because today, 8 out of 10 people who are persecuted for religious reasons are Christians. And it's an absolute tragedy, or it's absolute travesty is probably the right word, isn't it? That in the Western media, we don't report it. And that's not just me as a Christian opinion, it's been something that's been raised in think tanks by non-Christians who are looking kind of concernedly at why is it that, given how much it happens, it gets such a low priority. Now it's starting to change a bit because of those voices. And this morning I could go off on a big long one on why I think that is the case, but I won't, because I want to kind of come back to the emotional context again. That Jesus actually kind of promises that because you are in me, he says, this is in the Last Supper, the Father loves you because he loves me, and therefore actually, even when you're being persecuted, the Father is with you. And just like with Jesus on the cross, sometimes when we're going through those things, and particularly, and I don't want to trivialise it because my experience has not been what so many of the church have had to go through, but particularly when the part of the context of that is real persecution. I had a privilege of doing some ministry for a lady who'd gone through the Rwandan genocide and had watched her family being butchered, and has this remarkable story of grace. And people have gone through things that are quite appalling, And there can be times when it really does feel, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because that is the feeling. But like Jesus, we kind of come to the place of recognizing he has been with us. There is both an emotional layer, but even when that gets worn thin and we feel like we can't feel it anymore, there is a logical truth that the persecution can only last for a moment or so. And in the long term, as we kind of get through those things and we recognize and see the hand of God in us and with us, and we come into that experience which is about being in Christ, which is, there's part of who God is that is so unintelligible to us as humanity. But as I often like to put it this way, is the strange thing is that in Jesus we have the ability to know something of the unknowable God, because we know him, we know the unknowable part of God through the knowable part, who is Jesus, the Son. And because he is the Son, the thing we know about the unknowable part is he's our Father. And whole part of that terminology of fatherhood is because a good father knows how to protect and look after and care for his children, while at the same time releasing them to their independence in the world, so they don't stay as children. And I don't want it to sound like a trivial thing to say, well, he lets us go through it to make us mature. It's not what I'm kind of arguing for. What I'm saying is in all of those experiences that sometimes seem very confusing, and we can always find Jesus, and through Jesus we always find the heart of the Father. So that's probably enough to say I've given myself an awful lot of pain this morning. I'll show you the kind of, if we just say, look, these are the kind of things I've been having to walk through. There are just loads of these along this way. It was a bad move, and I'm wearing shorts, so these have been lashing up my legs. But those are my thoughts around the goodness of God. The fact that at the spiritual level, we don't always have intellectual answers, but there is a place to find that emotional security of, in Christ we know the Father. Through the Son we know God's fatherhood. And so my prayer today is you find those moments where you can rest in that kind of place of comfort. It's something it's good to do daily. If you have an affectionate relationship with someone, you want to emotionally feel them as often as you can. And while our faith is not all about feelings, because even Jesus goes to a point where actually his experience means it feels like God's abandoned him, the truth is he is with you. But there is also those moments where the emotions break in. So those are my thoughts for this morning. It's been good to be with you, and tomorrow I will choose a more sensible route. And in the meantime, I'll just let Banjo say goodbye as he does a bit of a Jurassic Park through the corn. See you then. Until tomorrow.